Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to learn to find the length of the transverse axis and the conjugate axis. The transverse axis is actually very simple. It's the length from vertex to vertex. So the transverse axis starts at the one vertex and goes across through the center to the other vertex. So the length of this transverse axis is 6. Now I also want to emphasize that half of the transverse axis is A. A is half the length from the center to a vertex. So our A value is 3. Our conjugate axis, which we'll do in just a minute, if you go from the vertex straight up until you hit what's called that line of symmetry, not line of symmetry, sorry, the asymptotes, these diagonal asymptotes, and you go over, it tells you the length of the conjugate axis. In other words, you form this little rectangle that goes right out to the vertices and then out to this. So the conjugate axis is actually longer than the transverse axis. The conjugate axis for this one is a total of 8 in length, which the B value is half of the conjugate axis, so it's 4. The B value is 4. Now the B value always goes underneath either the Y or the X if it's opened up. Remember, if it's opened left and right like this one is, X squared is over the A, and we're minusing the Y squared, which is over the B squared. Sorry, this is A squared. That's why it's a 9. A is half the transverse axis, which is 3. Square it, that's where we get the 9 from. 16 is half of the conjugate axis, which half of the conjugate axis is 4, which when we square it, we get 16. But again, you just count across and type in 6. So 6 is the length of the transverse axis. Again, this one will be very simple. If it's asking for the transverse axis, you don't necessarily need to draw all that stuff. But again, I just want to emphasize that the transverse axis is from vertex to vertex. So it went from 6 to -6. So the length of the transverse axis is 12, which means our A value is going to be 6. And since this is opened up and down, the Y squared is first with a 36 underneath it. I'm just teaching you this for a future lesson. The X squared will be next that we're minusing, and then you'd have to find the length of the conjugate axis, which remember what you do is you go left or right now from the vertex until you hit those asymptote lines, and then you go straight down like this, forming this rectangle. And it tells us that the conjugate axis is 6, which means our B value is 3, and underneath the X squared would be a 9, and then that equals 1. But again, the transverse axis was 12. Again, I'm going to skip this transverse axis. I think I've talked about that enough. Okay, here's the conjugate axis. Now again, the conjugate axis is a line or the distance from the vertex up to the horizontal line, since this one's open left and right, where, again, what I like to do is I like to go from the vertex straight up until you hit that asymptote, and then you go over, and you form this rectangle. And in a later lesson, we will be talking about how to come up with the equations of those asymptote lines. And they're not very hard. They're linear equations. But the conjugate axis, though, goes up to 6 and down to -6. So our conjugate axis length would be 12. And again, if I was to write the equation of this, it would be x squared over, since the transverse axis has a half a length of 3, it'd be over 9, minus y squared over 36 equals 1. Again, that's just for a future lesson. Helps you get familiar with it and ready. Again, we'll do one more with the conjugate axis. What I do is I just go straight over till I hit this vertex, and so that means the half of the conjugate axis is 4 in length. You go all the way over to here, so the total length is 8 for the conjugate axis. If you have any questions or more concerns about this, please feel free to contact me. Again, don't let the center confuse you. If the center is elsewhere, you still just go out like this, up. So you form that little square or rectangle. I know my transverse axis is 4. My conjugate axis is also 4. So A and B are both 2. So again, down here, I'll just type in 4 because they're both 4 in length. Again, jumping ahead really quickly. Again, here, again, the first value will always be your transverse axis. And remember to square root it, which square root of 64 is 8, and that's half of it. So then you have to double it. So double 8, we have a transverse axis of 16. Again, always that first term, square root the 144 is 12, double 12, it's 24, is the transverse axis. When we get to the conjugate axis, it's going to be underneath the second one. So the conjugate will be underneath the x squared, the minus term. Square root 64 is 8, double 8, it's 16. I'm glad I went this far to make sure I got to these. Conjugate, it's going to be underneath the y squared, the minus term. Square root 144 is 12, double 12 is 24. Again, if you have questions, please do bring them to class.